Thank you so much for joining us on the stage 3. My name is Tuğçe Erel. Thank you for introduction. As the title is mentioned, Kitchen Politics, How to Not Exclude Artists and Cultural Workers and Caring Responsibilities. We are privileged to have Sascia Bailer, curator, writer, and researcher of profound expertise, who will delve into the topic with her unique insights, deeply connected with the notion of care. There is an unpleasant tendency for a woman's role as caregivers to taken for granted. In relation to the prejudice, the infrastructure is against women's labor, such as the pay gap between men and women. In the climate of ongoing neglect of discrimination against women for their forced and uncompensated caregiving labor, how it is possible to enable changes? What do we understand from care? Since the title of Republica 2024 edition is Who Cares, it is quite possible that some colleagues have already mentioned the linguistic connection between curating and care. The Latin word curare means to cure and to care. Care practices have been recognized in the cultural field in the last few years, and I hear and see more often several institutions bringing the theme into discussion, including my institution, Art Laboratory Berlin. However, how can we create caring structures and infrastructures, but not buzzwords? How can we create careful cultural environments? From a cultural perspective, Sascia Bailer will focus on the spirit of curatorial activism. She argues in favor of bringing the invisible structures of the art sector for the fore, as these define who is included, who is allowed to be visible, and who is not. She explores the question of what conditions need to be created to allow a variety of artists, staff, and audiences with caring responsibilities to be present in the arts. Illustrated with practical examples, Sascia Bailer presents the caring infrastructures, methods she developed which is intended to guide cultural professionals to transform the infrastructures of the cultural sector, step by step, according to the principle of feminism care ethics. Before I give the floor to Sascia for her presentation, who is joining remotely today, let me briefly give some background information about her. Sascia Bailer is not just a researcher, writer, and curator, but a unique voice in the field, working at the intersection of care, gender, and socially engaged art. She earned her practice-based PhD at the Zurich University of the Arts and the University of Reading, which draws from her participatory curatorial program on care as artistic director of M1 in 2019 and 2020. She works independently and in collectives on care, motherhood, and structural transformation, such as the initiatives Mothers, Warriors, and Poets, and the Caring Culture Lab. Sascia, so the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tuğçe. Thank you very much for this warm welcome, this introduction. It's my pleasure to be here, even though it's only virtually today. And I'm very happy to talk about how we can include cultural workers with caring responsibilities in the cultural sector. So the central question that I would like to address today is what conditions need to be created institutionally to enable the presence of a variety of audiences, artists, and contributors, and especially those with caring responsibilities. The image that we can see in the background is an artwork by Hannah Cook, a cultural-based artist, and we see her piece called Ada versus Abramovich. And here she inserted herself and her young daughter, Ada, when she had just given birth and she was still breastfeeding. And so she inserted herself into the famous artwork of Marina Abramovich, the artist's presence, to challenge the narratives that artists who are young mothers cannot be present in the art field. And so for her, it was, I guess, visually, aesthetically important to be present, to insert herself, to inscribe herself, but also to challenge the narratives, for example, put forth by Marina Abramovich, who had announced publicly that She had up to 3 abortions in order to dedicate her time and her life to her career as an artist, claiming that it wouldn't be possible to be both. So the question of today is, how can we be both caregivers and creatives? And I would like to take you along, on a short stroll through this question and the field. So before I go and talk about propositions and possible strategies, I want to take a moment to look at the actual status quo. What happens when gender and care intersect? So before we look at this question in the cultural field, I want to look at it in the overall society and economy. And I'm sure many of you are aware that we have a huge gender care gap. So women in Germany perform 44% more unpaid care work than men. But the contrast is not only between men and women, but also between women who have children and women who don't have children. So there's something called the lifetime motherhood penalty, which indicates that women who have up to 3 children in Germany have a loss of income of 70% over the span of their lifetime compared to a woman who doesn't have children. And of course, this unpaid labor, this unpaid caring labor, has an impact on the pension at the end of a woman's life. And so also here, women have almost 40% less of a pension than men. So what this indicates is that we cannot separate the questions of caring responsibilities and gender equity. And this is true for society at large, but also for the cultural sector. So if we want a cultural sector that embraces gender equity, we need to take into account who cares for whom and in which capacities and what kind of support structures can we offer. So when we look at the gendered relation in the art field, we can see that even though the art world tends to be or it likes to think of itself as quite avant-garde, we can see that the gendered gaps are quite larger than in the overall economy. So for example, the gender pay gap in Germany is 18%, but in the cultural sector, it's up to 31%. And not only are women paid less in the creative sector, but also their works are to be seen less often. So for example, in the Alte Nationalgalerie in Berlin, only 1.5% of the museum collection contains artworks of women. And if we add caring responsibility to this mix, then we also see this tendency where the cultural sector just kind of worsens the situations for caregivers. So 42% of parents have announced to experience discrimination in a professional context. And in the cultural field, 92% of parents have stated that they are confronted with negative prejudice and that their needs are rarely considered in the funding and scholarship landscape. And a recent study for the Swiss context by Visate has shown that only 7% of the residencies are family friendly. So what does this mean? Parenthood can have quite a real impact on an artist's career because it's extremely difficult to find residencies that you are welcome in. Many are really afraid to mention that they have children. It's very much real that parents who announce that they have children are then uninvited from residencies or exhibition projects. They're often very precarious economic situation forces them into different sectors, so they completely fall out of the art field. The high expectations in regards to flexibility are just not compatible with regular daycare center hours. And a lot of the activities in the art field occur in the evening when commonly parents are at home with their children. So they really fall out of these social circles because caring relationships are not just there for a week. You have caring responsibilities often over decades. And if you fall out of all these circles for decades, then it really has a stark impact onto your visibility, your ability to be present in the art field. So what we need is support structures. We need caring infrastructures that enable cultural workers with caring responsibilities to be present in the art field. And I've written a whole PhD about the notion of caring infrastructures, but to make it very concise, I want to show a meme because I think it's quite spot on in order to explain what I mean by caring infrastructures. So as Tuce in the introduction already mentioned, there is a tendency, quite a trend, a hype of art institutions to make exhibitions about care. But what is really lacking is the provision of support structures for parents and other caregivers in the artistic field. And as this meme implies, this is often not so much embraced by art institutions. So what we really need is to lower the discrepancy between what art institutions talk about and what they actually perform and enact on the background. And for this, I want to show a few examples. So caring infrastructures is a way to practice what we preach as cultural practitioners so that the theme and the organizational structure actually align. And it's a way to enact feminist care ethics. So to recognize that we all give and we all receive care all throughout our lives, that we are not exempt from needing support and care, and that we are in sort of, interdependent webs, and that we should recognize those and act accordingly. So these invisible infrastructures must be reorganized and made visible as caring infrastructures. As also Tuce mentioned in the introduction, curating comes from the Latin word curare, to take care of. And historically, this has been understood as a caretaking practice for art objects or collections. And I argue that we need to expand the sense of curatorial care and to embrace it as a care for presence. So a care for presence for a variety of audiences, artists, and contributors, and especially those with caring needs and with caring responsibilities. The question is, what can this care for presence, what can these caring infrastructures look like? In my PhD, I articulated several of those sort of propositions for caring infrastructures, and they stemmed from a practice-based engagement with this question. In 2019 and 20, I was the artistic director of an art space in rural northern Germany called M1 Arthur Boskamp Stiftung, and there we conducted a participatory programming on care. And from these practices, practicing the questions of care, I derived sort of methods, strategies that I felt would be necessary to share with the wider community of curators, of culture practitioners, in order to enact care and not just address care as a theme. So some of the images you will see in the background stem from these formats. So in order to curate with care and in order to enable a visibility of caregivers in the art field, and be it as freelancing artists, as audience members, as fellow curators, as speakers, we decided to always have free on-site childcare for all of the events that we conducted in the framework of this programming. Because we were situated in a rural context, we also spent a lot of time organizing carpooling, sometimes offered shuttle buses, and we tried to think about lowering barriers within the space. So of course, the space should be wheelchair accessible, but also to think about language accessibility and the avoidance of visual and auditory overstimulation, which was particularly necessary for people with hearing devices, since we also worked with a lot of elderly communities. We also offered free shared meals with all of our programming, and we made an effort to enable residencies for collectives with children. So one of the collectives we worked with was Maternal Fantasies, and I think they were present with 9 adult artists and 11 children. So all of these are sort of small measurements. We can call them micropolitics. So really, yeah, small efforts, gestures that overall make the space accessible for people, not only with caring responsibilities, but also with caring needs. And there is a lot of synergies to be made between different social groups and their needs. So it's not so much only about fighting for artists who are parents, but also to think, well, what kind of other needs of accessibilities and inclusion of different groups do we have, and where do, what's the meeting ground, and how can we create caring infrastructures that serve a variety of audience members? And in relation to temporality, there's also a lot to unravel in the cultural field, because the the tendency to do all of the programming in the evening really structurally excludes artists with caring responsibilities, and often for decades. So at M1, we try to schedule most of our workshops on the weekends in between 11 and 4, and we offer childcare and shared meals. So this allowed it for a lot of families to actually be present of public programming, and also for artists with children to facilitate these workshops. There's, of course, not one single time slot that works for everyone, but what we need, what we need is an openness to experiment with different times and formats, and to be in dialogue with the community for whom and with whom we program. And also to think about temporality in terms of breaks. Do we enable informal dialogue and exchange and networking within the community? Because oftentimes programming is so strict that you cannot, even have a lunch break or just meet the people that you've been sitting next to for several hours. Another element of temporality is the notion of aftercare. So in a neoliberal project logic, oftentimes we just plan until the day, until our funding runs out. But it's actually really important to also think about, well, what happens to the social relations that we have fostered throughout the programming once our funding runs out? What kind of aftercare can we envision from the onset of the project? Another element or area of practice is budgets and funding. And in my experience, it's actually the area where we have the most agency as curators and cultural producers to install caring infrastructures. And this can happen in a micropolitical manner, that we have small changes that were maybe less rigid and less bureaucratic about how things are done. So for example, at M1, we tried to embrace the notion of less is more. So we only did one workshop per month, when we could have done maybe one every weekend. But that we only did one per month allowed us to have enough budget to pay everyone involved fairly, including some of the community members if they were involved in a role in, let's say, a storytelling cafe series. It allowed us to invest in the personal support structures for artists who had children. So we would pay for the travel of the partner or the children if this was desired. We turned a former gallery space into a family/quiet space where also the childcare took place. And this place still exists today. So it's possible to also channel project funding into a physical infrastructure that can outlast a project. And another element that I find quite important in terms of enacting care is the nexus between freelancers and institutions. Often freelancers, and we saw this during the pandemic, are not really considered part of the responsibility of any institution, and they're kind of left to their own when there is a pandemic or a Bahnstreik or whatever. And I think it's important to also consider them financially, for example, in the form of cancellation fees. So all in all, I think it's important to shift the focus from art objects and to really include also people into the notion of curatorial care, because they are the ones that ultimately, sustain the art field and make it possible for artworks to be seen, to become public, to be made. When I speak about the necessity of caring infrastructures, a lot of times people approach me and they tell me, well, it's not really possible. We don't have these budgets to do all these things. And I'm, of course, aware, as someone who has also worked in the cultural field for many years, that curatorial budgets are very much limited. So what we need is a curatorial degrowth agenda. So if the budget is restrained, which it most cases is, we need to minimize the scale and maybe also the speed of the project rather than the pay and the offered support structures. Another response that I get often is that, well, if we as a small art space only do 2 exhibitions per year instead of 6, then we're not compatible anymore for future funding. And so I think what is necessary is also to regard these decisions to do a curatorial degrowth, to make them transparent, to make them publicly as a political stance, and to hopefully also inspire a collective change through inspiring other cultural institutions to follow suit. So the curatorial care for presence, for caregivers, for care receivers in the cultural field can be more feasible, at least through a curatorial degrowth agenda, so that we free up resources that can be invested in support structure that enable the presence of a variety of voices in the cultural sector, and this includes caregivers. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very happy to discuss this now in the short Q&A with Tuce and the members in the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Saskia, for this very thought-provoking, amazing. I don't know if you hear the applause here in the room.
I do.
Amazing. So it is really important to remember, relearn, to be reminded about this precarious situation. So this is like a kind of a important situation. If anyone has any question in the room, I would like to give the moment. Otherwise, I would like to just quickly go back to the little introduction when I was introducing you that you are one of the co-founders of Caring Culture Lab, which is actually allowing institutions to learn how to care and then how to make it a kind of a careful environment in the culture. So while maybe people are just thinking for their comments and questions, maybe you can just talk about the Caring Culture Lab.
Yes. I'm happy to. The Caring Culture Lab is an initiative that me with other collectives, for example, the Mothers, Warriors and Poets, are currently also present in the audience. I see them sitting there. We have been thinking about this initiative for some time because what we realized is that through our activism that we've been doing in the cultural field, in the respective cities and regions that we live in, that a lot of solutions have already been articulated, and some of them live on the websites of these different collectives. Some have been, established in collaboration with institutions or with municipalities. But what is lacking is a platform that brings this knowledge that already exists together, and most importantly, transfers it into institutions. So I think right now institutions are kind of observing. I mean, they see surely the tendency that care has become much more of an issue. But I think they're still kind of laid back, thinking that there's not that much pressure for them, that they actually need to act. And I think if we gather our voices, our energies, our knowledge and strategies of how the cultural sector can become more accessible to people with caring responsibilities, and I think we have quite a powerful organization that can also teach institutions how to do better and to embrace these caring infrastructures in their everyday practices. And we're still in the steps of founding this organization, so it's still new, but it's something that has been with us for a long time. But we're very much hoping that this can soon become, an organization that can share this knowledge, and possibly we're also launching a caring culture certificates. So if the institutions have gone through the process of implementing caring infrastructures, let's say making a residency family friendly, that they would be certified and also put on pressure on other institutions to follow suit.
Do we have any questions on the room? Because then I want to also share our encounters when we were matched together. We were exchanging emails, and then I was impressed with your signature. Can you share your signature with us? Because this is important for the mental health of the caregiver.
Thank you. So my email signature, I don't have it open right now, but it says something along the lines that due to caring responsibilities, I'm available on these hours, and that I will not attend to emails in the evenings, nor on weekends, nor during school breaks. And I felt this was a necessity because as a freelancer, which I currently am, you have nobody to sort of, put boundaries for you. If you work in an office and somebody calls and you're not there, they will say, well, Sascia Bailer will be back next Tuesday or something. And as a freelancer, there's this expectation that you're available the entire time. There are many times I receive emails on a Saturday, and on Monday morning, they expect me to say if I'm going to be part of this programming as a speaker, what the title is, send an abstract. And I felt the need to just set some boundaries. And and this is a way of enacting a form of self-care in an environment that doesn't automatically care for you as a cultural practitioner. And it's also a way to, bring my caring responsibilities into the conversation of a professional context, because often this is looked down upon, and I want to just put it out there as something that is important, that's also part of my life, and that I'm just not 24/7 available for work-related questions.
Thank you. I think this was a very maybe private thing, but I find it quite worth mentioning and then just bringing to this like a closing discussion. And so I think there's a question here.
First of all, thank you so much for your work and what you're doing, because I have the feeling that a big change is happening in the art world for the last, I would say, 10 to 7 years. And we can see now more and more women speaking up, and also men, but mainly women speaking up and making this a topic and demanding space, which I think is very, very important. At the same time, I'm wondering how you feel when it comes to the topic of care, childbirth, and things like that in art itself, because when I visited, I think it was Documenta 15, there was actually a space for kids. There was a Montessori space and there was a space for older kids, and I nearly cried. Like, I have 2 little kids, and we were actually able to really enjoy the 2 days we had there, and they had a great time, and it was an artistic experience. I have a friend who puts her childbirth into her work. She's a photographer. There are more and more paintings, more artists who make this a topic. Do you think this is counterproductive? Are you welcoming this? Can you just give a statement and say how you feel about that?
Yes. Thank you for your question and for your feedback. Yes, I can't tell if it's my personal perception that I see it, becoming more of a theme, or if it's actually becoming more legitimate for artists to place questions of birth and motherhood into the center of their work. There's a lot of very important work currently being done by Hetty Judah, who has launched a book, Acts of Creation, and an exhibition that visualizes the experience of motherhood, of breastfeeding, of raising children, and doesn't shy away from that, because yes, there is a kind of narrative that childbirth, motherhood is sort of a taboo even within feminist discussions, so that it was seen as something that would put women in their role as caregivers, and a lot of feminists wanted to break free from that. So they intentionally also shied away from focusing or giving space to the question of the maternal in artistic production. But I do see it changing currently. I see the questions of feminism and caring topics, maternity and childbirth, breastfeeding, all these questions coming together in an empowering way. And I hope that we can continue this path. And there are a lot of, important collectives working on these topics. I'm one of them, one of Mothers, Worries, and Poets, where we try to bring both the themes of motherhood to the fore, but also create structures and support structures for artists with care and responsibility. So I think things are happening, and I hope that we continue this path collectively and across different cultural contexts.
So thank you all for being part of this conversation. We're out of time, unfortunately. And thank you so much, and good evening.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining.